The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or Things Are Not What They Seem. Greetings, dear listeners. Dear listeners, in my paperback collection is a slim volume called Sherlock Holmes vs. Dracula by the incredibly prolific Lauren B. Estelman. But this story features a vampire of a different sort. Today's video is a brief review of the Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It is one of the stories which appears in the casebook of Sherlock Holmes. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, stop right now. Stop! I put links in the description to the text, courtesy of Project Gutenberg Australia, as well as to a fine audiobook recording by Greg Wagland for Magpie Audio. Once you have read or listened to the story, please rejoin us, as you will now be able to follow the discussion with greater clarity. Today's video is also based on a discussion of the story by my local Sherlock Holmes group, the Regina Irregulars. And features my ideas along with those of my fellow irregulars. I was leader for the discussion of The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. Now, to begin, Conan Doyle was no stranger to vampire stories. The book, Vampire Stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, edited by Robert 18 Basang. And yeah, you heard that right, Robert 18-Basang and Martin H. Greenberg, features 9 vampire stories, including Sussex Vampire, but defines the idea of the vampire rather loosely. 3 stories, The Captain of the Pole Star, John Barrington Cowles, and The Parasite, concern women leading men to destruction. In the case of John Barrington Cowles, a vamp, not a vampire, a vamp. But more on that in a moment. Meanwhile, the early story, The Winning Shot, written when Conan Doyle was only 24, back in 1883, featured an extraordinary vampire-like individual called Octavius Gaster, who uses willpower to commit murder. The Ring of Troth, or the Ring of Thoth, I never know how to pronounce that, is a tale of Egyptian necromancy, while the American's Tale features a most unusual vampire, an enormous carnivorous plant. In addition to Sussex Vampire, the editors list 2 other Sherlock Holmes stories, The Adventure of the Illustrious Client and The Adventure of the Three Gables. Both of the above Sherlock Holmes stories feature villains that could be best described as vamps as opposed to vampires. According to Merriam-Webster, a vamp is a woman who uses her charms or wiles to seduce and exploit men. However, in the interest of equality, a vamp can also be male, as in Baron Gruner in Illustrious Client, while Three Gables features a more traditionally vampish Isadora Klein. Now, in his book, Arthur Conan Doyle's Art of Fiction, A Reevaluation, Professor Niels Clausen makes a compelling case that Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories are not mere detective stories, not mere puzzles, but works of literature. The complicated structure of the Sussex Vampire certainly appears to confirm his theory. Now, before we proceed any further, here are the questions I asked my fellow irregulars. 1. What mysteries confront Holmes and Watson and the reader at the commencement of this story? Why do you think Conan Doyle took this particular structural approach? Question 2. Many things are not as they seem, or as they are initially presented in this story. What are some examples? 3. Mrs. Ferguson is said to be Peruvian, with a fiery Latin nature. Why do you think Conan Doyle chose to make this character South American? 4. Conan Doyle often recycled plot elements. What are a few examples of this in Sussex Vampire? 5. Were you disappointed there wasn't a real vampire? I guess that should be a spoiler alert. 6. Bonus question. Which queen in English history sucked such a wound to draw poison from it? The story opens with, and my source here is Project Gutenberg, Australia. Quote, Holmes had read carefully a note which the last post had brought him. Then, with the dry chuckle, which was his nearest approach to a laugh, he tossed it over to me. For a mixture of the modern and the medieval, of the practical and of the wildly fanciful, I think this is surely the limit, said he. What do you make of it, Watson? I read as follows. Vampires. Sir, our client, Mr. Robert Ferguson, of Ferguson and Muirhead, tea brokers of Mincing Lane, has made some inquiry from us in a communication of even date concerning vampires. As our firm specializes entirely upon the assessment of machinery, the matter hardly comes within our purview, and we have therefore recommended Mr. Ferguson to call upon you and lay the matter before you. We have not forgotten your successful action in the case of Matilda Briggs. We are, sir, faithfully yours, Morrison, and Dodd. Now, why such an odd opening, featuring a letter about vampires on behalf of a tea merchant from a firm specializing in the assessment of machinery? This is quickly followed by a letter from the tea broker, ostensibly on behalf of a friend, which relates a terrifying account of an attack on a baby by the child's own mother, the woman being caught with the baby's blood on her lips, making her the Sussex Vampire of the title. Guess that should be another spoiler alert. My first question for my fellow irregulars was, 1. What mysteries confront Holmes and Watson and the reader at the commencement of this story? Why do you think Conan Doyle took this particular structural approach? Well, regarding the structure of the story, one thing that struck me about this use of letters, was it a homage to Dracula, the most famous vampire story of all time? Sussex Vampire is supposedly set in November 1896, but wasn't actually published until 1924, making it one of the last Sherlock Holmes stories. Number 52 out of 60. Those of you who have read Dracula, which was published in 1897, know the story is told through letters, diary entries, and other documents, just as this story begins with a discussion of two letters. The first letter connects the idea of vampires with the world of business, hence Holmes's comment, for a mixture of the modern and the medieval, of the practical and the wildly fanciful. Thus, as readers, we are confronted with the mystery of how these things are connected. Holmes then looks through his index to find information on vampire folklore among accounts of actual crimes, again muddling the practical, true crime, and the wildly fanciful, vampire folklore. Indeed, Holmes concludes, quote, "Rubbish, Watson, rubbish. What have we to do with walking corpses who can only be held in their grave by stakes driven through their hearts? It's pure lunacy." End of quote. Fortunately, Dr. Watson comes to the rescue and provides us with a hint of where this story is going. Quote, "But surely," said I, "the vampire was not necessarily a dead man. A living person might have the habit. I have read, for example, of the old sucking the blood of the young in order to retain their youth." End of quote. Holmes then reads Ferguson's letter, supposedly written on behalf of a friend, prompting Watson to say, quote, "Of course I remember him," said I as I laid down the letter. "Big Bob Ferguson, the finest three-quarter Richmond ever had. He was always a good-natured chap. It's like him to be so concerned over a friend's case." Holmes looked at me thoughtfully and shook his head. "I never get your limits, Watson," said he. "There are unexplored possibilities about you. Take a wire down like a good fellow. We'll examine your case with pleasure." "Your case?" "We must not let him think that this agency is a home for the weak-minded. Of course it is his case. Send him that wire and let the matter rest till morning." End of quote. Conan Doyle is clearly indicating that this won't be a typical vampire story, and any vampire in this story will be examined by Holmes's practical methods. One final note on the contrast of the medieval and the modern. Consider Watson's description of the interior of Ferguson's house, Cheeseman's, Lamberley. Quote, "The room, as I gazed around, was a most singular mixture of dates and of places. The half-panelled walls may well have belonged to the original yeoman farmer of the 17th century. They were ornamented, however, on the lower part by a line of well-chosen modern watercolors, while above, where yellow plaster took the place of oak, there was hung a fine collection of South American utensils and weapons, which had been brought, no doubt, by the Peruvian lady upstairs." End of quote. Mysteries. Ah, mysteries. Things are not what they seem. Which led to my next question for the Irregulars. Many things are not as they seem, or as they are initially presented in this story. What are some examples? Well, here's a short list off the top of our collective heads. A business letter inquiring about the unlikely topic of vampires. Ferguson's letter, supposedly about a friend he is trying to help. Watson's memory of Ferguson the athlete, Ferguson now being a careworn middle-aged man. Jackie as a loving son, a very charming and affectionate youth, and a poor little inoffensive cripple, when actually he's the villain of the piece. Mrs. Mason's behavior. Quote, "She began to watch her mistress closely, and to keep a closer guard upon the baby, whom she tenderly loved. It seemed to her that even as she watched the mother, so the mother watched her, and that every time she was compelled to leave the baby alone, the mother was waiting to get at it. Day and night the nurse covered the child, and day and night the silent, watchful mother seemed to be lying in wait, as a wolf waits for a lamb. It must read most incredible to you, and yet I beg you to take it seriously, for a child's life and a man's sanity may depend upon it." End of quote. In the end, it turns out that Mrs. Mason is actually guarding the baby from Jackie in concert with Mrs. Ferguson. The maid Dolores, who is initially presented as sullen, but who is a good and faithful friend to her mistress. Jackie's claim he was assaulted for no reason. Yeah, there was a reason, and a serious one at that. Jackie's behavior in general. I mean, if you have read or listened to the story, is this the behavior of a 15-year-old? Even back in the Victorian times? I don't think so. Carlos, the spaniel's paralysis. No, it's not the result of spinal meningitis. And finally, Holmes staring out the window rather than at the baby. No, he wasn't staring out the window. He was watching the reflection of Jackie's face in the window. Dear listeners, can you think of some other examples of things that are not as they are initially presented? If so, please share them in the comments below. Next question. Mrs. Ferguson is said to be Peruvian, with a fiery Latin nature. Why do you think Conan Doyle chose to make this character South American? And you know, I honestly don't have a good answer to this question. I wondered if Conan Doyle was riffing off the idea of the vampire bat. After all, Mrs. Ferguson's blood drinking is similar to the way a vampire bat preys on its victims, and vampire bats are native to South America. Conan Doyle would have been familiar with these animals, which, according to PBS, were first documented in 1810 and described by Darwin in 1839. Of course, the other reason may have been Conan Doyle's wish to contrast Mrs. Ferguson's stereotypical fiery Latin nature with that of her stolid Anglo-Saxon husband. Consider the following description of the baby. Quote, "A very beautiful child, dark-eyed, golden-haired, a wonderful mixture of the Saxon and the Latin." End of quote. By the way, as noted earlier, Conan Doyle's friend Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897. Stoker apparently had clippings about vampire bats among his research notes. Next question. Conan Doyle often recycled plot elements. What are a few examples of this in Sussex Vampire? Here are some that our group noted. Ferguson's South American wife, similar to the Brazilian wife in The Problem of Tor Bridge. Jackie makes use of a poison weapon, similar to Tonga's poison darts in The Sign of the Four. The villain experiments on an animal. See also The Sheep in Silver Blaze. An exotic poison, this time from Africa, also figures in The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. And another wife hides something from her husband to avoid hurting him in The Yellow Mask. Dear listeners, Did you spot any other examples of recycled plot elements? Last question. Were you disappointed there wasn't a real vampire? Please share your feelings about that in the comments below. I also asked the group a bonus question. Which queen in English history sucked such a wound to draw poison from it? Don't know? Don't feel bad, as none of us knew the answer either. But if you're really curious, really curious, I put a link to an article about the monarch in question in the description. I remember feeling rather disappointed the first time I read this story back in the 90s. I wanted a real vampire. But, as I hope you can see from our discussion, the disappointing case of the Sussex Vampire is actually a short story of some nuance and complexity. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Niels Clausen for his work showing that the Sherlock Holmes stories are serious works of literature, not mere puzzles, not mere detective stories. If this is your first visit to my channel, please consider subscribing. My name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring such cryptids as the Night Floaters, werewolves, and the Black-Eyed Children. So again, please consider subscribing. Please help me to reach my goal of 2,021 subs in 2021. And would you be interested in hearing more reviews of Sherlock Holmes stories on this channel? Let me know in the comments below. And till midnight, cheers! Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pix Here, that's PX Here, while the music was Unseen Horrors by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod.